Profile share via email report story. Warning: adult content at the end of this chapter. This will most likely be the last chapter that will contain it. Blank. The rest of the day was full of mirth and laughter as they carried on with their day to liven up the mood again. Proof of their activities were found across the sand bed in the form of sand castles and footprints from their volleyball competition. All in all, it was an amazing day. The sun was beginning to set, signifying their day would be coming to an end soon, but for a particular blue-haired beauty, it signified the moment she would see herself in vulnerability from her overdue confession. She wanted to back out, but alas, it was far too late. The group laid sprawled out on the sand, others cozied up in chairs after their delicious feast to digest the heavy portions. Sanji thanked the heavens he packed extra food because apparently, going through a near-death experience makes you pretty hungry, according to Luffy that is. They were chatting amongst themselves, all except for Vivi, whom only awkwardly grinned here and there, often peering at the blonde that was sitting next to her from the corner of her eye to work herself up. She couldn't ask him if he was ready to talk in front of everyone. It would be too obvious. Right, noticing her inner turmoil, Sanji moved to stand from his crisscrossed position on the sand, wiping the grainy remnants off the back of his legs. Vivi-chan, would you like to take a walk? He asked, reaching a hand down towards her, as the rest of the group now curiously listened, wondering why he specifically wanted only Vivi to join him. Except for our two wing women anyway. A small smile began to splay across her lips. Sure, she said before taking his hand. Is everything okay between them? Chopper asked. Usopp crossed his arms out in front of him with a raised brow, as he observed the two walking towards the swaying water. Yeah, that was kinda weird. Nami could only giggle in response, anxious to see the outcome. After a few minutes, she became aware of Sanji's huge smile and the way he sheepishly scratched the back of his neck. It seemed like he said something that caused Vivi's mouth to drop in disbelief and she began to laugh. I wonder if he had the same idea. Not long after, the two found themselves enveloped in each other's arms. Robin chuckled, looking up from her book to glance at the pair. We may have a new couple within our group, it seems. Those two are dating now. Luffy asked with a shocked expression. Nami smiled roguishly. Only one way to find out. She cupped her hands around her mouth and from her seat on the sand, she yelled loud enough in order for her love-stricken friends to hear her. Sanji-kun, what's your answer? Both snapped their heads in the direction of the group with dazzling smiles. They observed as Sanji quickly said something to Vivi, to which she nodded. He released her momentarily, then raised his arms up and shaped them to form a heart, resulting in joyful cheering from the group. Promoted stories. You'll also like. I Can't Hate You, Zozen. 45.7k 1.5k. Zozen AU. More info in intro. Heads up, if the chapter is titled with lowercase letters, it is not necessary to read, but I added it for fun. It is just unnecessary thing. 3D2YA One Piece fanfic. 370k 6.2k. Luffy stumbles upon Nami by chance on a small island after the crew was separated at Sabayati Archipelago. The two decide to train together, but then comes the warm, weird One Piece X Reader Onishots. 7.4k 108. One Piece X Reader fluff, angst, yandere, and stories centered around the characters of One Piece and their wonderful world. This is my first time writing X Reader on. Let me help you. A Luffy X Nami fanfic. 211k 2.6k. After Luffy's battle with Doflamingo at Dressrosa, Luffy is now once again reunited with Sabo. Reuniting with Sabo somehow made Luffy remember about Ace and Hada-Ryuk. One Piece. Plant Island. 8.4k 120. Another republished Luffy x Hancock Zoro x Robin Sanji x Nami random, made-up character in the story. Strafuts visit an island with any and every plant, looking for Medici. Our last sale, on hold. 169K6K. Luffy time travels to the past. Can he change the fate of his loved ones or will he fail them again? Let's read the story to find out what happened to the young pirate K. Daughter of the Sea, One Piece. 22.1K875. You are invited to read the tales of the woman who would soon rule the hearts of many in the seas alongside the Strafut pirates. One Piece X Black Reader Majority of T. Nami took in the atmosphere and there was no doubt in her mind that this is what her friend had envisioned. Behind them, the brilliant hues of crimson and orange began to trickle across the radiant sky and there was a cool breeze that rustled the elongated leaves of the palm trees. She was extremely happy for Vivi and there was a sudden sense of tranquility and belonging that overcame her. Despite Luffy's scare, today has been perfect in every way and taught her that she was so thankful to be surrounded by her friends in the good times and bad. To be able to share these wondrous moments with them, made her realize this is where she needed to be. I did it, Mom. Suddenly a gentle tap on her shoulder shook her out of her thoughts and she was met with onyx orbs that flashed with excitement. Nami, I want to show you something. Blank. With a blanket in hand, Luffy led her to a more secluded area of the beach that he had scoped out earlier. It had a spectacular view of the sunset and Nami took in the magnificent scenery, unable to hold back the hushed, whoa, that escaped her. I figured we could be alone for a little bit before heading out. He formed a gentle smile upon seeing her eyes shimmer with excitement. This is absolutely perfect, she exclaimed, awestricken. His chest throbbed just from seeing her look so happy. Satisfied with her reaction, Luffy took a seat on the ground against the stump of a small palm tree and wrapped the blanket around himself. He spread his arms and legs a bit, signifying he wanted her in his arms. Do you want to sit? Nami nodded, looking down at the man with eyes full of love and adoration, and she moved to sit right in front of him, situating herself in between his legs before leaning back to marvel in the feeling of his warm chest against her back. Upon doing so, Luffy wrapped the blanket around her too and nuzzled his face against the back of her neck, plating a small kiss there as he hugged her torso tight. The peaceful moment had her heart doing somersaults and they sat for a few minutes in a comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's warmth. In the horizon, there was an assortment of warm colors that began to reflect against the cascading waves in the distance, and the fiery orange sun began sinking slowly. The sun kinda looks like one of Nojiko's tangerines, he snickered. She chuckled softly, observing the landscape before them. You're right, it's really pretty. Quote dot dot dot. I'm happy I was able to come here with you, Nami, he said. How is it possible that everything he said made her smile like an idiot? So am I, she replied, feeling extremely comfortable in his embrace. Did you have fun? Yeah, he exclaimed, feeling oddly at peace. You know, honestly it's kinda crazy. She hummed softly, smiling warmly as she nuzzled against his chest a bit. What is? I'm not sure why, but whenever I look out into the ocean, I just feel like I belong there. Nami laughed lightly. That's ironic, considering you can't even swim. She teased. Hey, he formed an open-mouthed smile and writhed his fingers against the sides of her hips, pulling mirthful giggles from her as she squirmed against his chest. She gasped, thrashing within his grip. L. Luffy, that tea tickles. He didn't stop though, he loved the way her laughter joyously filled his ears. Okay, enough. She cried between laughs, attempting to surrender to his vicious tickling assault to no avail. As the man continued his motions, His laughter mixed in with hers, and she breathed in heavily in attempts to fill her lungs back up with air. To stop his tortuous ministrations, she gripped his wrists in place. Okay, okay, she huffed, smiling brightly. He chuckled, resting his forehead into the crook of her neck. Nami eventually ceased her fit of giggles before inhaling deeply to catch her breath. I get it though. I feel like there are certain places or people that just resonate with us and you can't help but feel like it was meant to be. He hummed softly in agreement. Have you felt like that before? He asked. Nami nodded against his chest. With cartography, for example. It's almost as if it were my calling to travel the world and make maps. It just feels so right. Or maybe I sailed the seas in another life, who knows? She replied, hoping he wouldn't come to the conclusion that she was insane. Suddenly, memories of their last few months together flashed in her head and it made her chest flutter. The phone calls, the motorcycle rides, the study sessions. The parties he'd drag her to in order to encourage her to associate more for them to only end up in the corner of the room, chatting alone. Their movie nights, their picnics, just everything. She was so in love with him that she didn't know what to do with herself anymore and she found it funny, how despite her efforts to push him away when they first met, he refused to back down, proving to her time and time again how much he wanted her in his life. Something the night she met him had compelled her to agree to seeing him again the next day and thinking about it now, she felt extremely grateful that she did. Whether it was fate or coincidence, she knew it was meant to be and she knew she'd never love anyone that way she loves Luffy. Feeling a bit lightheaded by the sudden bubbling of emotions, Nami continued, getting swept up in the moment. You know, I feel the same way about you, Luffy. Luffy's lips stretched into a smile. Like you and I were meant to be together. Yeah. She whispered, feeling her cheeks burn. His face lit up. Nami was able to put exactly what he was feeling into words and it made his heart swell. Pulling her tighter against him, he buried his face deeper into the side of her neck, inhaling her scent. Man, she smells so good. He noticed how tiny she felt gathered up in his arms and suddenly, his heart felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. It was kinda overwhelming. In that moment, he could only think to say the first thing that came to mind that would best describe the way he currently felt. Against her neck, she felt him mumble something but couldn't make it out. What? She said softly, gently stroking a spot on his arm with her thumb. Luffy pulled his head away a bit and rested his chin atop her shoulder. I love you. He spoke, barely above a whisper. Nami froze, her eyes slowly opening wide. Did he just? Her heart was beating harshly against her rib cage. And looking out into the endless lapping of gold-speckled waves, she felt her eyes begin to water. He loves her too. She shifted around, turning to face him, and she placed a gentle hand against his cheek, caressing the area gently with her thumb. Her touch made him aware of that tightening feeling within his chest again and it was honestly becoming pretty unbearable. He loves her so much. She was so taken aback that when she opened her mouth to speak, nothing came out. So in an attempt to convey her feelings, Nami raised her chin to connect their lips. It was indescribable. She'll never grow tired of the way his lips molded perfectly against hers. Feeling his eyes droop, Luffy reached out to cradle her face, deepening the kiss. The sensation leaked all throughout them, and unbeknownst to the two, their hearts began to race in unison. Every single touch left him feeling absolutely lightheaded and this rang true, because when she pulled away from him, he let out a shaky breath, unable to process his strong waves of emotion that surged within him. She rested her forehead against his, her chest throbbing with joy. I love you too, Luffy, she whispered. He winced, swallowing thickly before he raised a hand to his chest. At the lack of response, she pulled her head back to gaze at him. Luffy, are you all right? She said with furrowed brows, noticing his troubled expression. Quote dot dot dot, I think you might actually kill me one day, Nami, he stated. She tilted her head, her features contorting even further in confusion. What are you talking about? He lifted her hand from his cheek and laid it flush against his chest right over his heart. See, he remarked. Confused, Nami eyed his chest, but once she focused on the erratic vibrations coming from underneath her hand, her eyes widened slightly, her own chest beginning to match his. He pinched his brows together. I'm scared it's gonna explode. A warm smile began to stretch across her face, and without thinking twice, she reached to grab his free hand, mirroring his action to place it flush against her chest over her heart. Look, you make me feel the same way. Luffy's lips formed into a big, cheesy smile and his shimmering eyes flickered back to meet her gaze. Her heart was pounding just like his. And there was no doubt in his mind. It's love. Blank, she knocked out. Mumbled Zoro, looking back from the driver's seat. Poor thing must be exhausted. Robin interjected. Now back in town, Zoro was parked in front of Nami's building since the four of them carpooled to the train station together, and they were now debating on whether or not they should wake her up. The side of her head was laid atop Luffy's shoulder and she was peacefully asleep. Luffy quietly opened the car door before slowly shifting in his seat. He wrapped one arm behind Nami's shoulders and another under her knees to scoop her up onto his lap. I'll bring her up, you guys go ahead, he said softly, trying his best not to wake her up. You sure? Zoro asked in a hushed tone. Luffy nodded, flashing them a toothy grin. See you guys later, he said before climbing out of the backseat with Nami in his arms. She was pretty light, so he figured he'd just carry her upstairs to avoid waking her, and he could always just ask Sabo to pick him up. He made his way inside the lobby and pressed the button for the elevator, taking a moment to gaze down at her while waiting. His brows pinched together as he eyed the girl in his arms. Even asleep, she had the ability to make his chest throb. Stepping off on the 12th floor, he approached her door, twisting his upper half slightly to ring the doorbell with his elbow, and about 30 seconds later, he was met with a smiling Nojiko, whom smiled even wider upon seeing Nami fast asleep in his arms. She wanted to squeal due to the adorable display, but held back to not wake Nami. Come on in, Nojiko whispered, stepping aside. He greeted her with a grin before entering the flat and stepped inside the sweet tangerine-smelling room, sauntering over to her bed. Luffy laid her down carefully and took a moment to glance over her sleeping figure one final time. The emotions coursing within him could only remind him of what he had told her earlier. Yeah, definitely love. He turned to leave the room but immediately stilled when he heard her soft voice call out to him. Luffy? She asked groggily, cracking her eyes open. Open. He found himself smiling widely before turning back to her. Hey, come here. She mused, placing a hand atop an empty spot on the bed next to her. Although Luffy was considering telling her he needed to head out so she could rest, his legs moved on their own and he was inevitably drawn in by the way her alluring eyes called out to him. He pressed a knee onto the firm mattress and before long, he was crawling to her side in a daze, propping himself up on an elbow to hover over her. He smiled, lifting his hand to place it on her hip before rubbing smooth circles against it with his thumb. You should get some rest, Nami, he hummed lowly. Does he even realize what he's doing to her? A shiver ghosted her spine and even in her drowsy state, her body began responding to him. A part of her was disappointed by the turn of events between them back in the changing booth. But now she was dying to get her hands on him. With lustful hooded eyes, she wrapped her arms around the back of his neck and pulled his face to hers, no longer feeling tired. Luffy thickly swallowed, overcome with the intoxicating aroma of her hair. Nami, he uttered. It was addicting, and when the tip of her tongue slowly slipped out to wet her rosy plump lips, he just about lost it. Their faces were close, really close. He could feel the soft fanning of her warm breath against his lips and he was oddly intrigued by the glint her dark eyes held. Kiss me, she whispered breathily and subdued. The man trembled a bit and refusing to wait another second, he crashed his lips against hers. Their kisses were passionate and needy and just the thought of him reaching deep inside her caused the girl to moan against his lips. Luffy was feeling it too. His erection was stiff and pressed against her thigh, thing that made an intense heat pool between her legs. She needed more. He gently bit her bottom lip, slowly dragging his teeth along the length which caused her mouth to shoot open in a silent moan and she pulled on his neck, desperate to feel him even closer. Taking full advantage of her open mouth, he began tonguing her, and she blessed his ears when she ripped an airy moan into his mouth. She was losing herself to the pure euphoria his tongue gave her. Although she loved the feeling of his slow, heated kisses, they just weren't enough anymore. Gathering all the willpower she could, Nami pulled away from him with a flushed face and lusty eyes. When she realized his expression mirrored hers, she couldn't wait a second longer. Skillfully, she shifted herself to climb on top of him, straddling his waist and her mouth watered upon feeling his manhood deliciously pressing against her most intimate area. Nami. He huffed, raising his arms to grip either side of her hips. With minimal effort, she swayed her hips forward, making the man hiss in pleasure. She dropped her head back with a heaving chest. Even through their clothes it felt so good. Nami leaned forward to grab onto his shoulders, nudging his face aside with her nose in order to have access to his neck. She licked the crook of his neck and began planting soft kisses up along the length before nibbling on his ear lobe. In a fit of desperation, Luffy pressed her firmly against his erection and rolled his hips upwards, pulling a whiny moan from her right into his ear. Nami. He groaned, clenching the material of her shirt. If we keep going, I won't be able to stop. With equal desperation, she released a hot pant against the shell of his ear and thrust it against him once more making the man moan. Don't stop, she whispered, before she sat back up to peel her shirt off. There was a fire burning within her. And she wanted Luffy to feel it too. To be continued. What do you guys think so far? I personally am not a huge fan of OFX, but I really wanted to shake things up. I personally thrive off of words of affirmation lol, so leave your thoughts in the comments if you can. Later. Where stories live. Discover now.